Hello, I'm Daniel Goleman. I'm a psychologist, a science journalist. I worked at the New York Times for many years, and I'm probably best known for my writing on emotional intelligence. What's little known is that I've been a meditator since my college years. I started when I was, I think, a sophomore or junior. I did a method that comes from India. It's called transcendental meditation. It uses a mantra. And I did it because I was anxious and I wanted to calm down. I found it did help me calm. Then I went on to Harvard, where I studied clinical psychology. And through some stroke of luck, I got a pre-doctoral traveling fellowship to go to India. So with my friend Krishnadas and another friend, I went off to India. And there I was lucky enough to meet some very unusual meditation masters. These are people who have devoted their whole life to practice, and they were quite remarkable. The first that I met was Neem Karoli Baba. He is an Indian yogi who, to my surprise, was completely present, completely loving, happy to see you anytime. And I'd never actually been in the presence of someone like that. When I say the presence, he had a kind of aura so that not only did you feel he loved you unconditionally, what was even stranger for me was that you felt you loved everybody else unconditionally, at least while you were with him. And then I went on to Bodh Gaya, where I had another lucky meeting with a Lama named Tsoknyi Rinpoche. Tsoknyi Rinpoche I first saw at dawn going around the stupa in Bodh Gaya with his mala muttering a mantra. He lived in a very simple room, probably half the size of this, that had one wooden plank bed. That was it. That was the furnishing. And he slept on the bed and he sat on the bed all day. And like Neem Karoli, he was open to anyone, anytime. And he felt that he was completely present, completely loving. And, you know, I contrasted that with my professors at Harvard, who were some of the most famous psychologists of the day, Erik Erikson, B.F. Skinner, people like that, who you could see between 2 and 3 p.m. on Tuesdays. That was their office hours. They had a very different attitude. They didn't have that open to anyone, any time feeling. I also studied a Buddhist system of psychology. And this was something that was very radical for me, because nowhere in my psychology training had anyone said there is a Buddhist system of psychology. This was a new discovery for me. It was called Abhidharma. And I particularly liked a book called the Visuddhimagga. This is a 5th century manual for meditators. It's very specific in what practices allow you to achieve what accomplishments. So I was very excited. I went back to Harvard and I said, you know what? There's a whole upside to human potential that we don't know about in our psychology. But they were not interested. There was only one person there who was interested, and his name was Richard Davidson. He was a fellow graduate student. So Richie, as we call him, and I did our dissertations on meditation, despite warnings that this was a dire thing to do. It was career-ending, as we were told. But we did it anyway. So fast forward, Richie has become pretty much a world-famous neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin. He has a lab with more than 100 people. He has dedicated brain scan machines and all the latest equipment. And one of the things that we've done along the way, we're members of the board of an organization called Mind and Life Institute. And they put on a summer session where they would invite graduate students and postdocs who were interested in doing research on meditation, but generally were at a place where no one else was interested, like was the case with us, but brought them all together. And they've formed a new wave of studies in cognitive science and neuroscience of meditation. When Richie and I did our dissertations, there were only 3 articles published in the scientific literature on meditation. When we did this book, which is called Altered Traits Here, The Science of Meditation in Hong Kong and Commonwealth countries. I don't know what the title will be in China. At any rate, when we did that book, we looked through those 6,000 articles using very rigorous standards, the very top. We wanted only the top articles in the best journals. We found about 60, and those are what I'm going to summarize for you here. It's very clear from the scientific literature that there are changes in the brain that mean changes in how we think and how the mind operates, even in our biology. And what we didn't know when we started is now something that's understood widely in neuroscience, is a concept called neuroplasticity, which means that the more you exercise a brain circuit, the stronger it becomes, the more connected it becomes. And the less you exercise it, the more it weakens. And meditation is a systematic strengthening of brain circuits, and I'll make that a little more clear. We also look at 3 distinct levels. One is beginners, which we see as up to 100 hours of lifetime practice. Most of the studies are done with methods like mindfulness-based stress reduction, which was developed by another friend of ours, John Kabat-Zinn, for use in hospitals and clinics, but now it's spread more widely. That gives people about 28 hours. The next level is long-term meditators. Most of the people who, or many of the people who study with Tsoknyi Rinpoche are long-term meditators. This means you have a day job, you have a family, you have responsibilities, but you also make time somehow for meditation. Maybe you do it daily. You go to retreats maybe once a year, maybe more. And that group we see as having about 1,000 to 10,000 hours of lifetime practice. And you know, it means that you have to weigh your priorities in life. You might get up earlier so you have time to meditate. But you find some point in the day where you can do it regularly. And that regular practice, as you'll see, brings people to another level. And then there's the kind of what you could call Olympic level practitioner. These are professionals, so to speak. They're full-time meditators, they're monks, they're nuns, they're yogis, they're people who live in a culture that understands the value of full-time meditation and supports people to do that. So those are generally Asian cultures. To study them, as I'll explain later, Richie had to fly them over one by one. So at each level, we see the same brain circuits get stronger and stronger. And with the beginner, let me talk about, first of all, stress. When we're stressed out, when we're upset, when we're traumatized, what happens is the amygdala, which is in the emotional center, right in the middle of the brain, it's the brain's radar for threat. The amygdala triggers the fight or freeze response. And that means that the body biologically prepares for, to fight or to flee. And that means it shunts energy from the immune system, from the cardiovascular system to the legs and arms. Our organs, for that time being, get weaker. The immune system weakens, but we're ready to take drastic action. And unfortunately, in modern life, this system gets triggered over and over again, and some people never have a chance to recover. The body was designed to have an occasional stress response like that, not to have it constant, as is unfortunately the case so often in modern life. But the good news right from the beginning is that the amygdala becomes less reactive to stress. So under pressure, the amygdala doesn't react as strongly. Also, another good news, the recovery from the peak of the amygdala response is quicker. This is the definition of resilience. Resilience is measured technically in how much time it takes you to recover from the peak of stress back to calm. And you see that right at the beginning too. Another thing that happens during the stress response is that inflammatory chemicals are unleashed in the body because of those biological shifts. But again, in the beginning meditators, you see that is lessened, that release. And that's good because these inflammatory chemicals that stress causes are one of the factors in long-term chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, cancers, and so on. And then finally, just in general, there's less biological reaction under stress. Then so those are all changes in how the amygdala behaves. The other big set of changes occur in the prefrontal cortex. This is the brain's executive center, right behind the forehead. This is the part of the brain that thinks, that plans, that decides, that can make complex decisions, that learns. And this is also the part of the brain that controls attention. Well, meditation is an attentional exercise. No matter what you're doing, Tsoknyi Rinpoche has a line, keep mindfulness on guard. Mindfulness means that you're focusing on one thing, or you're in one mental set, and your mind wanders off, as our minds do about half the time. And then mindfulness means you notice it wandered and you bring it back. That's like a mental fitness exercise. It's very parallel to going to the gym with a weight, and every time you do a repetition with that weight, you make that muscle a little stronger. Every time we bring our mind back with mindfulness, we make that neural circuitry that much stronger. And basically, this is what is found with attention right from the start in meditation, that the prefrontal cortex circuitry is getting stronger and stronger. It means people's mind wander less, they can concentrate more, they can focus on one thing and ignore distractions. And one of the important things today has to do with multitasking. Multitasking, I should tell you, is actually a fiction from a scientific point of view. The mind doesn't do things in parallel. It switches very rapidly from one to the other. So if you're doing that one thing that's so important today that you have to get done and your concentration is right up here, and then you think, I better check my email, or maybe I got a WeChat, or let's see what's happening on the internet, and you start going here, and then you know, a while later, minutes later, half hour later, who knows, you come back to that one thing. Ordinarily, your concentration that was up here would be down here. But if you've done some meditation, some mindfulness particularly, then your concentration will still be up here. So it is an antidote for the loss of focus in multitasking. And then, very important for students, this was a surprise finding at the University of California. If one group of students learned mindfulness, and they did it for several months, then another group did something else comparable. And they found that the students who did mindfulness learned better. Their memory was better. They're able to retain and recall what they had learned later. And this was the big surprise. On the graduate school entrance exam, their scores were 16 points higher. It really, really paid off in terms of their academic performance. And that's all from strengthening the prefrontal cortex circuitry. Then there are meditations about compassion, kindness. There are many such. One is loving kindness. Another is, there was a set that was taken from Tibetan practices and rendered acceptable for anyone. It was done at Stanford. Emory has done this. I should say, by the way, that the research that we reviewed is from the very best places, from Harvard, from Yale, from Berkeley, from MIT, that the research is going on at the top universities now. There are three kinds of empathy. One is cognitive empathy. That's, I understand how you think. I can take your perspective. And cognitive empathy allows you to communicate effectively with someone because you know the mental models they use. You know how they label reality, and you can label in the same way. The second kind is emotional empathy. With emotional empathy, you use a different set of brain circuits. It's not the neocortex as in cognitive empathy. It's what's called the social brain. These are circuits in the forefront of the brain that tune into another brain and form an invisible brain-to-brain linkage. And this allows emotions to pass instantly from person to person. And through that circuitry, you feel what the other person feels. That's the second kind of empathy. The third kind of empathy uses entirely different circuitry. This is called empathic concern. It's the basis of compassion. And empathic concern activates the circuits that we share with all mammals, for it's a parent's love for a child. So compassion strengthens those circuits, not the cognitive empathy, not the emotional empathy, but the caring circuitry. And here there's a lot of research. There's, for example, brain studies show that just from the beginning there's more activity in those circuits for caring. People become more generous. It pays off. They're more likely to give to someone who is in need. People also, this is an interesting side effect, they're happier because activating that circuitry also activates the brain circuits for feeling good. It feels good to help someone out. There's this Tibetan saying that the first person to benefit from compassion is the one who feels it. And this is exactly what the brain studies are showing. Another important finding is that people who do this kind of practice are able to be more present to another person's suffering. Ordinarily, when people are with someone who's in distress or suffering or upset, this washes over them through that second circuitry, the emotional empathy. And unfortunately, people sometimes handle that by just tuning out. I remember friends of mine who have done a retreat on the streets of New York where you live as a homeless person for a week and you do your practice there, say that the most painful thing for them is that once you become a homeless person, you do not exist. People don't look at you, they walk right on by. And that may be because they're managing the distress that they'd feel if they really tuned in to a person who's in such need. So there's less of that tuning out. People are more empathic in terms of feeling with suffering, but they don't turn away. And they're more likely to actually help, to like give up a seat to someone on crutches, something like that. And very interesting, unexpected benefit is also with what's called unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is us and them thinking that you don't even know you have. So it's a hidden prejudice, but it can be detected through some sophisticated cognitive tests. And it turns out that this diminishes with compassion practice too. So those are all findings right at the beginning of meditation. Then there are the people who are the long-term meditators. Remember, they're people with a daily practice, might go on a retreat once or twice a year, have a job and so on, but they're making practice a priority. And in our math, we counted the people in this category as having from 1,000 to 10,000 lifetime hours. So over your lifetime, you probably have never done this, but if you think, well, if I practice on the average a half hour a day for a year, that's a lot of hours. And if I do it for a decade, that's a lot more hours. And if I do it for several decades, it adds up. So these findings are in that category, and you find the same effects, but they're much stronger. The brain is continuing to change. There's what's called a dose-response relationship. So dose-response means the more you do it, the better the result is. And so when it comes to attention, the prefrontal cortex, you find that this circuitry has become even stronger. Focus is even better than in the beginners. There's more what's called brain efficiency. Brain efficiency is measured in a clever way. If you're talking to someone and that person says something and you start thinking about that thing, then you will not be present for the subtle changes in their face and so on that communicate emotion. And there's an analog of this in a cognitive lab test, where they find that long-term meditators have less what's called an attentional blink, which means that the brain is more efficient. It's dealing with what's here right now, and then ready for the next thing, dealing with that, ready for the next thing, ready for the next thing. One of the things I find encouraging is that long-term meditators seem to show less attentional and memory decrement with aging. You know, as people age, they tend to lose certain kinds of memory, and that effect seems to slow down. There's also a little controversy around this, but it seems that brain shrinkage, which also is inexorable from the 30s on, slows down with meditation, although exactly what that might involve is still a matter for scientific debate. But when Mingyur Rinpoche, Tsoknyi Rinpoche's brother, went on a retreat for 4.5 years, he happened to have been a subject in Ritchie's lab before he went, and he was interested to see what happened to his brain while he was away. So he came back to the lab, and he let Ritchie assess his brain aging. At age 41, his brain looked like a 33-year-old. So we know it at the highest level of practice it exists, and it's probably a spectrum depending on how much practice we do. One of the definitions, or the definition of maturity, is increasing the gap between impulse and action. And it turns out that the prefrontal cortex also has a circuit that can manage the amygdala, which is where impulse comes from, and that this too increases with meditation practice. And then there's the stress result. Remember, this is the amygdala. Again, everything you see in the beginners is more so in the long term, more equanimity. The amygdala is less reactive to stress. The prefrontal circuitry for inhibiting the amygdala gets stronger and stronger. They can see this in brain scans. One of the things that the amygdala does is release a stress hormone called cortisol, which is very effective in the short term and very destructive in the long term, because cortisol weakens the immune system, and cortisol release is also lessened with long-term practice, and there's an even quicker recovery from upsets. So all of the benefits that we saw in the beginners are enhanced. Same with kindness and compassion. The long-term meditators are even more present to people who are having pain and suffering, and even more likely to help if there's a need. We found one paradox, though. Every major spiritual tradition, particularly Buddhism, talks about the self as an illusion and deconstructing the self as part of practice. There are almost no research studies in the West on selflessness. We found maybe 4, and what they seem to show in long-term meditators is that the brain system for I, me, mine thinking, my this, my to-do list, my preoccupations, whatever, that circuitry becomes less strong. And not only that, but the brain area for attachment, for clinging, actually seems to shrink. That this is a brain change that was unanticipated. Most of the changes seem to be slowing the shrinkage, but this one seems to be enhanced, actually. Then there are general effects like effortlessness. The long-term meditators, particularly with mental tasks, the part of the brain which generates an effort, exertion, is more relaxed. This is what you see in champions. This is what you see in the brain of the master of any domain, a chess champion, that while they're executing their expertise, their brain is actually less active than other people. They don't have to think about it. And you see this also in long-term meditators. Another happy finding for long-term meditators, particularly those on retreat, 1 day of retreat turns off the body's inflammatory genes. As I said, inflammation is extremely important as a cause of chronic disease. And it seems that long-term meditation tells the genes that cause this to be quiet. This is called epigenetics. It's the understanding that it's not whether you have a gene or not. It's what's more important is whether the gene turns on or not. And here the inflammatory genes turn off. Whether it's clinically significant will take more research, but we think it might be. Another biological finding is that individual cells in the body seem to live longer. There's a cap at the end of DNA called a telomere, and this determines how long that cell will live and when it will die. And the telomeres seem to be longer in meditators. Metabolism seems to be slower. The breath rate slows down, and this is a sign of what's called parasympathetic arousal. Parasympathetic arousal is the body's recovery mode. If you're stressed out, you need to get into a parasympathetic mode in order for the body to recover. And this seems to suggest that long-term meditators are in that mode more of the time. And finally, there are the yogis. These are the people who are lifetime full-on meditators, 12,000 to 62,000 lifetime hours. These are people who flew over one by one to the brain lab at Wisconsin and went through extensive testing. This happened only because of the help of Matthew Ricard. Some of you may know of Matthew. He had a PhD from the French equivalent of MIT in microbiology, and soon after he got his PhD, he gave up that career and went to Nepal and became a student of a Lama, a meditation master, and then became the attendant to one of the greatest meditation masters of the last century, Tsoknyi Rinpoche. And Matthew went back to his scientific training to convince yogis that he knew, who he thought might be highly accomplished, to fly to Wisconsin. It's a long trip. It's a 4-day trip. Also, he had to explain what science is. The thing that seems to have made the difference was their understanding that if they went, it might be a benefit to humanity. That is, they had a compassionate motivation. None of them cared about how am I going to do on these tests? Not the point. Will this help other people? Will it inspire them to practice? Might. Okay, I'll do it. So there were 14 yogis from Nepal and India, and then 7 from a retreat center in France. If you do a 3-year retreat, by the way, you get credit for 9,000 or 10,000 hours. So 12,000 to 62,000 is a lot of meditation. One of the first findings, I was actually there in the room, Matthew was the guinea pig for this. They were trying out the protocol, and they had 4 different kinds of meditation: concentration, visualization, compassion, and open presence. And they for statistical analytic reasons, they needed Matthew to do the following. Do a concentration for 90 seconds. Then when you hear a bell, do nothing for 30, then do it again for 90 seconds, then do nothing for 30, 90, 30, 4 times for each meditation. I don't know about you, but when I meditate, sometimes it takes a little while for my mind to settle down and focus, but every yogi could do it instantly. The mental agility was unbelievable. So they all went through that kind of protocol. One of the big surprises had to do with a brainwave called gamma. We all experience gamma ordinarily, but only in a special circumstance. When you're struggling with a creative problem or trying to get a solution to a problem, the minute you get the insight, yes, that's the answer, your brainwave shows a gamma. It's the highest amplitude, highest strength brainwave on an EEG. And it also comes up if you vividly remember a time, say you bit into a peach, and the moment the smell and the taste and the sound and all that comes together in the brain, you also get a gamma. It lasts about a quarter second, half second. It turns out that the yogis have rich gamma from all parts of the brain all the time. It's not the only brainwave, but it's never been seen in a resting brainwave in anyone before. This is completely new to science. And the yogis relate it to kind of a spacious awareness, a presence, a readiness for anything. Another surprise was when they're asked to do compassion, the gamma wave was increased by 700 to 800%. That's another thing that's never been seen in science. Still another has to do with how they responded to pain. In lab tests, they have a kind of diabolical device. It's a square metal plate that can be heated very precisely to the point where it feels really painful, but your skin will not burn. So they find that point for each person in lab tests, and they give them a taste of it. Here's 1 second, and then they say in 10 seconds, you're going to feel that pain for 10 seconds. The minute they get a 10-second warning, the centers in the brain for feeling pain go shooting way up. And then during the pain, they stay up, and then for 10 seconds after, they stay up. That's in ordinary people. In the yogis, they get the 10-second warning, there's no change. The pain comes, and the brain circuits for sensory inputs go up, not for emotional reaction. Then the pain ends, they go right down, and then they're flat again. Something else never been seen by science. So it's quite clear from the scientific research that, first of all, the more we do, the more it impacts the brain, our body, our mind, and that this is an expertise which the modern world needs, I think, today more than ever. So I think bottom line is that any culture which still has the ability to protect, to nurture, and support people who have the techniques, who have the wisdom, have the knowledge for this kind of practice, would be doing the world a favor if they preserve it. Thank you.